I need to be mobile, so I'm going to take this out of here. All right, everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good. I can make sure I'm hooked up to the camera and to you here. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, although I must say that I'm going to miss the presentation we normally have in this time slot, which is from TOSHA, and they typically go over all the fatalities that happened over the last year, because I really find that we learn a whole lot from them each year about lessons learned, about how to create a better safety climate and safe workplace. So, I'm missing Steve Hawkins already, and he's not here. But anyway, it does give me the opportunity to talk to you today about a passionate topic of mine. Some people say, how can you get passionate about something like that? Well, as an HR person in my past, I always struggled with making sure we got it right in terms of how you approach employee discipline. It can be a very controversial topic, especially when you're talking about labor management relations. And you have to look at why we're doing what we're doing and what's the end goal, because the end goal is really what? To change behavior and to improve performance, right? It's not to look at how do we work someone out the door. It's more aimed at a cooperative relationship and how do we be able to retain a quality employee that we've hired into our organization. So it's in that spirit that I present today. I had a friend of mine that shared a story with me that I'm going to start with today, and he was telling me about he's an educator, and he was telling me about his first high school opportunity that he had coming right out of college, and so he got this new high school teaching position. He was so excited, and in trying to prepare for that, he spent hours and hours and hours and days and days and days for that first day's lesson plan, that was supposed to cover 1 hour of time for that first section of his class that day. And on his way to school that first day, he stopped at a gas station. And I'm going to be dating probably both of us here when I tell you the story, but he stopped at the gas station, and when he filled up, he got this strip of stamps, okay? And the strips of stamps were these little green stamps with S and H on them. Anybody remember S and H stamps? Yeah, I used to trade them in for, you get the little catalog and trade them in for things you kind of want, on your wish list. Well, he got a whole handful of those, and he stuck them in his pocket, didn't think anything more about it. And he got to class, and he was so excited, he got through his 1 hour prepared lecture in 15 minutes. So he looked down at his watch, he said, he was in a panic. He's like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do here? And he thought real quick, okay, what did my teachers tell me? What do I do in a situation like this? He says, okay, when all else fails, do a review. So he said, okay, I've been to the lecture, I'm going to do a review. So he started asking the class questions about what he had covered, and nobody was answering the questions. And so he got real nervous, and his hands started getting really sweaty, okay? And so he had, in his pants, he kind of stuck his hands in there, just kind of, wringing his hands, from all his anxiety. And then all of a sudden he said, okay. He said, how many of you have a question about what we've covered today that would be important to you? And streaming down from his hand was the strip of S&H stamps that were stuck to his hand because the perspiration on his hand. So all the students' attention went to what? The stamps that were hanging down from his hand. And so thinking very quickly, he had the student raise a hand. He said, what's your question? He asked the question, and so he answered it, and so he tore off an S&H stamp, licked it, and put it on the student's forehead. After that, all the students' hands were going up because they thought it was pretty cool to have a stamp on their foreheads, what a novel idea. And so what turned into an accident ended up being thinking outside the box very quickly for him on how to turn the classroom into an engaging situation. Now, the lesson that I'm sharing with you there is this. With employee discipline, you've got to think outside the box, okay? You've got to think differently about it. Just like, the S&H Green Stamps approach with him, turning that into an opportunity. We have to look at how we take employee discipline and turn it into an opportunity, okay? All right. Why do we do employee discipline? I mean, why discipline? Why do we have to have discipline in the workplace? Well, what's the opposite? Chaos, right? So we've got to be able to have some form of the way that we work to get things done. To allow individuality, but at the same time we have prescribed way that we have to do things. And two, we have certain work rules, or in our collective bargaining agreements, the work rules and shop rules, to make sure people are safe, right? That's important. Make sure people are safe, and make sure that we're able to sustain ourselves as an organization and for people to keep their jobs. What is the real goal of disciplinary systems? It's really to try to, as I said, improve performance. That's one. And also to make sure that we're able to avoid discharge, avoid a person getting in a situation where they, work themselves out of a job through their misconduct. And to also, although we hope that our hiring process is hiring the right kinds of people in the organization that fit within the culture, is that, it's a way to be able to make sure that we're able to meld people into the work groups that we have. Now, the funny thing that I think about when I think about discipline is that so many times we think of that word with a stigmatism to it, right? Discipline, it's a bad word. But think about this. Is discipline really a bad word? Is it? Or have we just given it a bad word? Treated it as a bad word in our own vocabularies? Well, look at this list I put up here, because all of these are about discipline. What about having a good exercise routine? What about having a healthy diet? What about improving yourself in terms of continuing education like you are today? What about exercising emotional intelligence and self-monitoring yourself in terms of conflict? Are those bad things? No, of course not. That's all discipline, see? We self-discipline ourselves, as well as the workplace has work rules to ensure that there's discipline. So really it's not a bad thing. It's how we handle the discipline that really causes the stigmatism to it, if that makes sense. Now, the thing that I want to talk to you about today with discipline is really, there's your traditional model of progressive discipline that we're all familiar with, right? Everybody familiar with progressive discipline? The traditional model, probably in most of our collective bargaining agreements, step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3, so on and so forth. And they might look a little different, but typically they're anywhere from 4 to 6 steps for most organizations. Anywhere from a verbal warning to written warning to 30-day DLO to discharge, and some places in between. Well, progressive discipline can have a role in terms of changing behavior, but what I want to suggest to you, as the title of my topic today suggests to you, is it's not always the right answer, okay? There's a place for it, there's a time for it, but then there's a time it's the wrong approach to use, okay? And that's why I want you to be thinking about this as I talk through this. And then secondly, positive discipline. You may have heard of this process. There's a very small percentage of companies that use this. I was fortunate enough in being on a couple main table bargaining negotiations that we were able to get into our agreement, embed in our agreement, a combined approach of progressive and positive discipline that I felt worked very well. Because there's a time for progressive, but then there's a time for positive. It depends. And that's what I want to suggest to you today. That's why I say there's shades of gray, all right? Take someone who, for example, that's been on time to work for 25 years every day. And then they're late that first day, and you slap them with a written warning or whatever your first step is in the progressive discipline process. And maybe they just left the hospital in a rush because they were visiting their terminally ill mother. Now, how is that going to be perceived? You see what I'm saying? What about the 25 years I was earlier on time, right? So that's where you can sometimes get a mismatch, and so I'm going to talk through that a little bit. Now, sometimes I have folks say, well, really, what is the difference between positive and progressive? You're still disciplining. The approach is very different, and it also gives you a very different result. Now, if I tell you to do something and I'm your boss, if you want to keep your job, you're going to do what I'm asking you to do, right? It's a direct order. We know about direct orders, right? But if I say, here's what we need to do, and here's what we need to accomplish, and here's where you fit in, then it's about what? My commitment and collaboration in working with you and engaging you in getting the job done, right? So that is the difference between compliance, because you're telling me to do it, and the difference between commitment. I'm going to do it even when you're not looking. Does that make sense? And that's really what we should be trying to create, the type of culture we should be trying to create in an organization. You know, in fact, what we run into, at least in my experience, is that with oftentimes when you have exclusive use of progressive discipline, sometimes you have people say things like, well, okay, this is what you're doing to me. You're doing it to me. You know, but again, why is the person in that situation? It's because of behavioral choices. Again, not about, but again, the focus should be on what's the right way to address that, positive or progressive. Now, I put this model up here, and some of you may recognize it with some semblance of situational leadership. Because I think when you think about discipline and approach to address situations, you've got to look at the situation. It's very contingent. I'm going to give you two terms. One is able, and one is willingness. Am I able? Do I have the knowledge, skills, and abilities I need to do the job? Okay, that's able. Willing, do I want to? And that may sound simple, but we know there's situations you have folks that don't want to do their job, or some aspect of their job, or they don't know how, all right? So if we take those two simple terms and we start putting them into different combinations, then we get a different result in terms of how we should really lead in managing that individual to behavioral change. If I have someone who is unwilling and unable, they don't want to, and I don't know how, and of course you may be asking yourself the question, how did they end up here? Anyway, but you want to try to salvage that person because you hired them, you have an investment in them, so how do you try to change that situation? The first thing you've got to work on is what? You send them to training? They're going to probably, because of they don't want to, you know, not listen to anything that is being said or anything that's being presented in the training, right? So what you have to do first is you have to work on that attitude, you know, and can you make anyone do anything? I wish I could sometimes, especially when my girls were teenagers, you know, you kind of wish you could make them do things, but we all know that you can't. Our best hope is what? To influence, right? So when you look at you as a leader in your organization, you have to look at how do we influence someone by looking at what's important to them. I've had many situations where someone says, well, I just hate my job. I just hate what I'm doing. I hate this department. And I said, and what are your goals? Well, I want to work in this department over here. I said, do you think being a bad doer in your current organization is going to open up opportunities for you in this other department? Right? See, what are we doing? Creating the need, right? It's the need that they want. So trying to work with them to be a good doer so they can get that opportunity down the road. And once you change that attitude, then the training is easy, right? We can get there. All right, then you take someone who is unwilling but able. Now, I'm going to bait you here just a little bit, that as managers, we tend to influence people into this category, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So we have to be careful about that. But this is someone, again, we send them to training. It cracks me up. These are the people we send to training. Okay, we're going to fix you. We're going to send you to training, and this will fix your behavioral problem. They could teach the class, all right? But yet we send them to training to fix them. So they're sitting back in class saying, oh yeah, tell me whatever you want to tell me. I already know all this stuff, which is true. What has to be addressed is the attitude, right? How they're perceiving the situation, how they're perceiving their work climate and their culture and their relationship with their supervisor. That's what has to be worked on. So we have to work at what's in it for them. You know, how do we get at that attitude to change where they want to improve? And then you have someone who's willing but unable. Now that one's easy, right? You send that one to training. You know, they're willing, they're eager beaver, but they just don't know how to do the job or some aspect of their job. So you send them to training. That's an easy fix. And then lastly, you have people who are willing and able. These are your rock stars. These are your people who do a very good job at what they're doing. They're really your role models. And here's what we do. All right, we all know this, okay? We give them more work and more work and more work. So-and-so won't do their job, we'll give them that too, okay? So we have to be careful about that because remember I said for folks who are unwilling but able that sometimes we create that situation that causes that or influences that. That's what happens. Think about it. If you continue to load, you know, kind of like at Thanksgiving. We got Thanksgiving coming up, right? I don't know about all of you, but you know, when my mother cooks, it's like a lot of food. And we can't just eat out of the nice fine china plates because they're too small. All right, we'd have to need 2 or 3 of those because she makes so many different kinds of foods. But you go to load that food up from grandma's house or from mom's house, and it's like you got the mashed potatoes and gravy running off the side of the plate. You know, there's a lot there. We're putting so much on these folks' plates that are willing and able to where eventually they quit and stay. Does that make sense? No matter how high their work ethic is, no matter how good of a worker they are, there's a breaking point. So instead of trying to use them as a role model, instead of trying to take this off their plate so we can put something else on because they're so capable, we just keep loading it up like Thanksgiving dinner, right? So we got to be careful about that. And the reason I share this is because when you look at employee discipline, do you see how each of these types of individuals would need to be approached differently in terms of how you would discipline and approach these folks and what would motivate them? All right, so it's important to get it right. It's important to get it right if we want to really leverage our talent in organizations, if we want to improve organizational performance. It's important to get employee discipline right. And so it's important for management to get a structured process in place that helps drive that performance. As many of you may be familiar, there's when you look at employee discipline, there's a lot of it depends, right? And there's something called Douglas factors, aggravating and mitigating factors. You know, what the person was mad, that caused the event, but the mitigating factor was they were running 105 temperature, or, you know, whatever it is. There's a mitigating circumstance. I'll give you a real example that I ran into once. I was getting ready for a staff meeting one day, and I was sitting there looking over some charts at my desk in the core office where I worked. And I heard this loud voice coming from my right. And I turned because I heard the voice yelling, if somebody doesn't do something right now, I'm going to kill somebody. This is what the person was saying. All right, well, that'll get your attention pretty fast, won't it? So I jump up. I recognize the person who I knew very well and had regular conversations with. It was an hourly worker. And you know, usually don't have any problems with him. You know, I was very disturbed what he said. And of course, in that situation, you have to engage whether you feel like it's safe yourself to approach the individual. But I felt safe in that situation and walked up and said, what is going on? I said, let me call your committee man. We're going to need to talk about this. So we got the committee person, and the 3 of us went into the room to find out what had happened. Now, obviously, you just can't yell out, you're going to kill people, you know, in a work environment. But the mitigating circumstance was his mother had just died like a week and a half prior, and another coworker had said some very unkind things about his mother to him. All right, now that does not excuse his behavior, but it was a mitigating circumstance. Does that make sense? Someone provoked him. So you have to look at those kinds of things when you look at employee discipline. And this employee in this case was disciplined, but it wouldn't have been. It wasn't as severe as it would have been had there not been the mitigating circumstance, and the individual who provoked it got disciplined. Typically, in an employee discipline process, you do, you know, from start to finish, a 360 view of what's going on. You don't just have someone report to you an incident and you go take action on it, right? Because you might find out there's a whole lot of more pieces out there in the puzzle about what really happened in that situation. So you have to make sure you do a thorough investigation and figure out what's the best way to handle it. Timely, but thorough. Now, with the traditional model of progressive discipline, it's really built around, you know, our philosophy of making a consequence for undesired behaviors. There's a consequence. You do this is what happens. It's the cornerstone of National Labor Relations Act, which supports this type of approach, but it's also the most, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most controversial in collective bargaining. And that's why it interested me so much, you know, when I did the research on it, because I felt like we didn't always get it right. We've talked a little bit about this already, but progressive discipline is a traditional punitive system. It's kind of like thinking about, you know, when a child does something wrong, you told them to make sure that they look both ways before they cross the street, right? And then they didn't, and they almost got run over by a truck. And you give them a slap on the hand, or maybe a slap on the butt, I don't know. But, you know, there's a consequence to it, right? And that's like progressive discipline. It's a slap on the wrist, and the slaps get harder and more frequent the more the incident reoccurs. Person doesn't wear their safety glasses in the workplace. It continues to happen time and time again. It may start out with a verbal warning. Before you know it, you're at a 30-day DLO because the person won't put their safety glasses on. All right, and so that is the process of progressive discipline. And with progressive discipline, managers have a basic protocols we've talked about, and very committed to. They tend to be very committed to the process and making sure we got to follow step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And of course, we all know in collective bargaining what happens when there's discipline. An automatic grievance, right? So now, not only do we have a situation where we're trying to improve performance, and we may not have gotten it right in how we handled it, but now we have a grievance we've got to deal with, right? Which may get handled sooner or much later. Make it traded off, when you have your main table negotiations, much later on, you have like a stack that may get traded off. Progressive discipline, there are some disadvantages. You have managers that may feel obligated. They have to follow, like I said earlier, step by step of the process, which they may not even agree with themselves for the given situation because maybe they're mitigating circumstances. It dwells on the person's past mistakes instead of future behavior, what choices they might make differently. Can we all change? Sure we can. And see, progressive discipline focuses on what they've done, not on how they can improve. Does that make sense? So what have you really done? You've got no commitment. You've got absolutely no commitment. There's just been a consequence with no commitment going forward. So have we really fixed the problem? The two advantages of employee discipline, it does impress the seriousness, of what happened. And sometimes it's necessary. I'll tell you that what I found in my research, this is my dissertation topic, is that when you have an employee that says, I didn't do it, it wasn't me, and you've got them on videotape, you have it filmed, they're doing it, and they say, I didn't do it, then more than likely positive discipline will not work. You're going to have to use progressive discipline because there needs to be a wake-up call. Does that make sense? This is really serious. We know you did it. I had an employee once that it was the holidays. And I don't know about you folks in your plants, but there's sometimes some fine spirits that make their way into the plant during the holiday period. All right? And we had a worker that had brought in his cooler of fine spirits and had a little bit too many driving a fork truck. And he was working in an area delivering bins that were literally a ton of pounds, okay, to the assembly line where there were workers working right on the line. And he was trying to load those up on the conveyors so that the workers could pull them off for the assembly line. And so he went to deliver his bin of parts and couldn't quite get it on the conveyor right, and it tipped over just at the right time when a worker noticed it was getting ready to just unload the whole load. And she grabbed the nearby worker, who had been crushed, by the way. She had not gotten her out of the way, and pulled her out of the way of the load that spilled. All right, so of course with this incident, the line stopped, and the supervisor that was assigned to that area rushes to the area and smells alcohol on this individual's breath. Asked him if he's been drinking. Oh no, I've not been drinking at all. I'm fine. Haven't had a drink. But in that situation, someone's life was almost lost. Okay? And so anyway, he gets brought to my office. We were working on 4 10s at the time, rotating schedule. There were 3 crews, 4 10s, and this was like in the middle of the night type scenario. It was, I think maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, something like that. It's brought to my office, and so I interviewed him, did an investigation, talked to other folks in the area to find out what had happened, and concluded that there was enough evidence to suggest that he was incapacitated in some way. Now, whether he took alcohol or whatever, there was a smell that many people smell distinctively on his breath. So he was sent home in a taxi to his home, so I get him home safe, because I didn't feel like he was safe to drive home. And and there was a disciplinary layoff with that. When he came back to work, it didn't have any more problems with him for a while. So then one day I see him in one of our training centers, and he comes running towards me. I'm thinking, oh no, he's charging. But he came running towards me. He said, I've got to let you know how that disciplinary layoff changed my life. He said, I was an alcoholic. I was in denial. I lied about it. He said, because of that, after that happened, he said, my family said, see the kinds of things that are happening to you and our family because you're using alcohol. And his wife and family left him. And then he got his life back together, and they were back together at that time, and he approached me, but he said, that made a difference. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about in terms of when progressive discipline works, right? There's a time for it, and there's a time not to use it. Because sometimes what we can get out of progressive discipline is unwanted emotional reactions, especially if people see it as not fair, right? You gotta make sure you've done a thorough investigation, what you're doing is completely fair. And you don't want to create fear of you as a manager. That was one thing that I can tell you I always tried to do when I worked in labor relations, is I tried to create a culture. It wasn't a day I wasn't walking the floor. There wasn't a day. And it may just be walking the floor and asking someone how their son's baseball game went, or what'd you think about the football game on Sunday. I mean, I would walk the floor because I wanted people to know that I was a person that they could talk to. Because you want to be able to know what you're dealing with, right? You can't help people if they're not willing to tell you what the problem is. And so you want to create an open door culture, and it's something I always try to work towards. With progressive discipline, people tend to be fearful, and not disclose. Although, as I said, sometimes it can be effective. And the example I gave you was one. And one other point that I make here in this presentation, it's on your flash drives as well, is that not only do you have the misbehavior sometimes you're dealing with of an employee, but based on how you handle that, that's what this slide talks about, is that it can affect how others see you in the organization. For example, you ever heard this in the organization? Oh, he was late 10 times and never got in trouble. I guess it didn't matter if I'm late, right? So it's a social justice concept, right? Or, boy, he was late one time, and they gave him a DLO. I better not do that, right? So it creates an environment not only that impacts the individual, but the whole culture and other employees. So you got to think about what you're doing and how it affects others. Okay, positive discipline. Now, this is aimed at more counseling. Now, have any of you had any experience with positive discipline at all? Some organizations call it consultation process. It has other names. No? Nobody? Okay, so some. Good. It's really aimed at not creating a consequence, but engaging the employee in discussion about agreements and accountability. Does that make sense? So you talk to them about what happened, their role in that, what the organizational goals are, how they're needed, how important it is, and get them on board that they agree, and then collaboratively with them come up with a way to be able to change that behavior. Okay, get some commitments from them. And sometimes there's what they call behavioral contracts, or contracts that you'll detail what they're going to do differently and put some time frame to it, and do some periodical counseling sessions with them. How's it going? Do you need some more training on this? You talk through it, and it's more of a collaborative approach. You know how long this has been around? Positive discipline's been around since about the whole idea or concept since the 1960s. And it actually came out of Canada, a guy by the name of John Huberman, and he implemented it in the Canadian paper mills back then. And one of the reasons he wanted to try it, because he was at his wit's end, if you will, because he had so many grievances he was dealing with in the collective bargaining agreement area, and he was also dealing with so much absenteeism and turnover. It was causing havoc on their business. So after he implemented the positive discipline approach, they improved productivity by 20% the first year. they reduce significantly grievances. So you see the positive effect. You look at each grievance, and I know all of you at some point have dealt with different varying levels of grievance resolution. It can be a very costly process, right? Not only in your time and energy, but in processing it and resolving it. It can be very costly. So they were able to really improve their business and sustain themselves. And so his whole philosophy was, you know, it's really not about discipline, it's about changing the behavior. Now, the thing with positive discipline, there's 5 main points. First thing, you want to make sure people are clear about what you need from them and get them on board. You're not telling them, you're showing what the goals are, but how they fit in, and get them to engage in that conversation, to agree with that. There can be an oral reminder, it might include a written reminder, and it may advance if they continue to engage in the same behavior to a decision-making lead. Now, how many of you have heard about decision-making leads? Some of you? Decision-making lead is the whole concept that some people may not agree with, but it's where you say, okay, here's the behavioral contract, here's the things that you had agreed to do. We're going to send you home for 3 days with pay to think about whether you want to do these things or not, because this is really the last chance, right? So it's that person's decision whether they come back and they engage in the requested behaviors or they don't. It's their choice. It's not you firing them, they're firing themselves. See, that's the concept of positive discipline. So you're trying to show them, hey, we're not trying to make this punitive. That's why there's always in this philosophy of positive discipline, no pay withheld. But to go home and really think about why we need them to be doing what we're asking them to do. And that's why it's a little bit different terminology, but it's called deselection. They're deselecting themselves because they're not agreeing to do what they had committed to do in the first place. As far as emerging trends, there's many companies that are starting to move away from this criminal justice mentality of progressive discipline and starting to look at other ways to be able to address employee performance and look at these things like behavioral contracts and non-punitive approaches. And there's different companies. I'm not going to go through all these, but just to show you that there are companies out there that are raving about their results and findings from positive discipline, like Goodyear and Union Carbide. There's about another 300 companies, or several companies that have implemented this approach. Although when you look at 300, it's a very small number of companies, isn't it? You've got 90% of companies plus using progressive discipline exclusively. And that's why I'm here today to talk about this. Because I think more of us should be using at least a blended approach, all right, on both positive and progressive. Here's some more: American Telephone Telegraph, Procter & Gamble, Union Carbide, some other users of the positive discipline approach. Why are some companies reluctant to implement positive discipline? Sometimes they don't really understand how it works or how it can really improve performance. They've not experienced it yet, so they really can't see the tangible results on the surface. And not really understanding the corporate culture and how it could be changed using the process. And also not really understanding how would we implement that. How would you translate that to a collective bargaining agreement? How would we get that in there? What would it look like? So the one thing we want to be able to do is to try to encourage organizations to be able to embed this in their collective bargaining agreement, to look at having policies that support a blended approach, and try to stay away from hard, fast rules. We do this way because that's what the rules say, no matter if it has consequences that are unintended, okay? Now, I'm going to briefly, how am I doing on time, Bill? I'm going to briefly talk about a study that I did to show you one result here. And again, this is just one study, but just to kind of show you some actual results. It involved a large Fortune 50 company with 584,000 employees, 5 divisions, and 109 facilities. I took 2 plants, one that was using a progressive model and one that was using a positive model. And you can see one plant had 3,400 and the other had 3,200 employees. Went into all their personnel records. You can believe it. Running lots of reports, and I touched lots of paper. This went over like a 1.5-year time frame. And there were 670 disciplinary observations in one calendar year that I selected. And there were 65.2% and 34.8% observations by plant respectively. Now, what I did was, in the progressive model, outline how they approached it. They actually had 8 steps. It went from informal counseling to verbal, written, and then the balance of shift. It went all the way up to 30 days, DLO, and then termination. So they actually had an 8-step process, which is pretty lengthy. And think about this. Every step of the way, grievance, right? Look at how the grievances multiply. By comparison, the positive model used this process called consultation process, and they had what's called zones: amber zone, red zone, D-day, and deselection. Amber zone is when you first sit down with the employee to say, hey, here's where you fit into the organization, here's how important you are, here's what we need from you, can you make this commitment, writing a behavioral contract, and getting them on board. And that's amber zone. Now, they have coaches at the first line supervision level. By the way, in this plant, it was co-labor management counselors. There were the committee people and the manager was coaching, because this was non-punitive, see? There was no punitive aspect of it. Red zone, if they got to red zone, it advanced to the HR manager and the committee man, as well as for D-Day. And then the D-Day would then result in either them changing the behavior, or there would be a choice where they deselected themselves, saying, I'm just not going to do this. I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. Now, in this study, this is the first time, by the way, that these two models have ever been compared side by side. I was shocked, because I'm like, why has this never been done? This model's been out there for a long time. There had never been a direct comparison between progressive and positive, and what really works. You know, and I have people ask me all the time when they find out that I've done some research on this, which one's better? And my answer is, I can't say this one's better or that one's better. It depends on what are you trying to do and what's the situation, right? Because it depends, as we've talked about. And so what I was trying to look for in this study is whether there was repeatability of behavior in one model versus another. So I looked at that. What was the impact on grievance load, you know, between the plants? And then, of course, my dissertation committee had to get real stringent with me and throw some other things in there for me to look at, like age and gender, okay? But I was more interested in the observations of the repeatability. I took all the different types of disciplinary actions, and I had to put them into categories, all right, of minor, major, and severe. All right, first time offense, someone not wearing the safety glasses we consider minor. You see what I'm saying? But severe might be an altercation in the workplace, a physical altercation. So we'd take those categories of events and put them into those categories. And then what we assessed the infractions based on the resulting grievances, the repeatability of behavior, and I looked at gender and age. In the positive model, there were 436 observations, no grievances in 98.6% of the cases. All right? No repeatability of the undesired behavior in 76% of the cases. All right. And safety violations, of those that did get repeated, safety was the one most violated. Progressive model, 233 observations and 0 grievances in 19% of the cases. Big difference there, right? So we had 81% resulting in grievances. No repeatability, though, was a little better, but not by much, 85.4%. Careless workmanship was the most repeated offense. And then just some other extraneous information I was able to pull is by discipline. Not that this, I think, is as relevant, but in the positive discipline model, 357 males disciplined from a pool of 429 observations. In the progressive model, 155 males disciplined from 233 case observations. But, you know, again, the makeup of the work group, too, I think kind of led itself to that. And the age categories I looked at, I put them into 18 to 38, 39 to 48, and 49 plus based on the age dispersion of the plant. And my results were the 38 to 48 was the most disciplined, and the 49 to 78 were the least disciplined. I think it's important for us to look at auditing our disciplinary process, as I've been trying to suggest to you today, to look at what works and what doesn't. Because the end goal is really about what? Sustaining that employee as a value contributor in the workplace and having organizational performance. at an optimal level. That's what it's all about. They go hand in hand. So that should be the role. We got to make sure that supervisors in particular and folks are familiar with what the rules are, take timely action, be fair, and to consider an integration of positive approach is also very relevant. I'll put this list together too because I thought you might find it interesting, and many of you may be familiar with this already, but 85% of arbitration reversals of disciplinary cases are for these reasons, okay? So how is your process and how are you stacking up? Either lack of evidence or look at number 2. This is the one that I see a problem with all the time, mitigating circumstances. Did you really consider the mitigating circumstances? And that's what I'm suggesting to you today before you take an arbitrary progressive approach. Rules violation, in other words, you violated your own rules, your own policy as an organization, not following due process, or the punishment didn't fit what happened, or management had some contributing factors to the offense. So we've got to think about discipline from an arbitrator's point of view as well. Very quickly, here's some errors that go along with employee discipline. Treating it solely as punishment. You did that, so now you're going to get this consequence. Right? If we think of it that way, we're not going to get the long-term result that we're trying to go after with behavioral change. The number one human need, I don't care who we are, male, female, doesn't matter our age, is the need to feel important. And so we feel the end game is to punish. We don't feel very important, do we? To the contrary. So it's important, again, to look at how we're really approaching employee discipline. And consider this alternative perspective that I've given you today, and to consider, because all of you are in different roles, that you have the ability to influence how you approach employee discipline. And so, again, I would encourage you to look at how you use both. Second error, treating discipline as an I you. It's me against you. I think we all know from personal experiences, one of the worst things you can do in trying to get the result you want is to dig your stakes in the ground. Congress is an example of that right now. When you put your stakes in the ground, you're going nowhere, right? So when you look at employee discipline from an I-you standpoint instead of a we standpoint, then you're not going to go very far, all right? And sometimes it's too little too late. We don't address the issue. And so, people are late repeatedly. We never say anything. And then when we finally decide we need to address it because it's become such a horrific problem, now we've created a problem we didn't intend to happen because you never addressed that before. Why is there an issue? So now we've created a problem when we didn't really have one in terms of how we could have handled it earlier. Another error is treating discipline as a non-progressive approach. Unless there's some progression, whether it be positive or progressive, you've got to have some advancement on how you're dealing with the issue to push for accountability and change, right? Because even the positive model has with it some steps that progress. They're just non-punitive. And then lastly, not really identifying what caused the problem. See, with the gentleman I gave you an example earlier, if I had just fired him or gave him a 30-day DLO for threatening to kill somebody, without investigating, I would have never found out we had a provoker in his workplace. See? That was, by the way, was a provoker not only with him, but other people. I was constantly dealing with this other individual, but we wouldn't have been able to address that issue. See? Again, still he was responsible, but I would have missed the root cause had I not investigated thoroughly there. So, what I challenge you to do is to think about how to make a decision about your disciplinary process and try to create a culture where employees trust their supervisors, see them as fair and consistent, see them as partners, see them as collaborators, and people enjoy being in a climate like that. So that's what I would challenge you. This guy here talks about our democratic workplace can mitigate a basic contradiction which marks American society. On one hand, our political ideas and national ethos install democracy and dignity, worth, and primacy of the individual. On the other hand, we daily submerge our citizenry as inferiors with authoritarian work practices. Think about that. Democracy, no it's not, right, in the workplace. So I'm going to conclude with stop, challenge, and choose. Look at your own disciplinary processes and what you're doing and how you might do it differently. And adopt policies, including embedding them in negotiations time, your collective bargaining agreement, because it can be done. I've done it. And it can make all parties feel better about how you're approaching employee discipline. And with that, that wraps up my portion of the presentation. I'm going to open the floor if I have a couple minutes. Do I have a couple minutes, Fan? For questions? Somebody's going to be my timekeeper here. Yes?
At one point you talked about age in the disciplinary process. I think it was 38 to 49 were the people that were most violating the process. And so I'm curious, that age group kind of lends itself to seniority issues. And so I'm wondering, is there a correlation between the age and seniority? And if so, if they've got significant seniority, why would they now suddenly become, or maybe it's not suddenly, but why then do they become a discipline problem? And what works best in order to solve that?
I didn't look at years of seniority as it correlated to age, but that's a great question. I mean, you know, you would think of learned practices, and you talk about social justice. If I've been around longer, I mean, one might infer that I kind of know how things work around here, and would make choices accordingly. But I didn't look at that part of in the study. I didn't look at that aspect. I didn't look at seniority as it related to age. I already had enough other things to look at. And that's a great question. I like that question. Any other questions? Yes.
Where is a good place to go, like, you know, with your labor management experience, where have you found a good place to go to, like, benchmark other people's discipline policies? And, you know, I mean, you go within the industry or BNA or...
well, actually, there's...
Or do you even benchmark?
There's some limited literature out there on positive discipline, although it's out there. The way that I found most of my information is through academic research. And so that would be available to you through, you know, academic forums. I don't know if you're graduating yet, you're between graduate school, right?
I graduated.
Yay! So you know what I'm talking about in terms of using some kind of academic database. You know, that's the way that I got at it. Now I'll tell you, there's a great book out there called Discipline Without Punishment by Dick Rode. It's real good. But again, you're going to find the literature very limited. I'm going to be spending more of my time researching the topic, although like I said, my study was the first one that compared these two, and you would have thought it would have been done much sooner. In my study, I had all kinds of implications for future research. You know, as some of the ones Carl's talking about, that would be an example of one that could be looked at. But
I would think when you're, you know, of course, most discipline policies, HR pretty much kind of unilaterally sets most discipline policies, don't they? I mean, it's not really a...
Well, you have work rules, but then you can also, that's what I'm still suggesting within those work rules, in your collective bargaining agreement, that you get some mutual agreement around how you're going to discipline. The consultation I mean, I know as you know, as union officials, you're not going to want to agree to any punitive action. But as far as consultation process, which is completely non-punitive, why wouldn't you want that as an alternative approach?
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. Just a comment. The issues you talk about here are not solely relegated to the disciplinary process and how to work with the people. I also had experience with placement, and so the placement process was based on the disciplinary process, punishment essentially. So the longer you were in leave for an injury or a disability, you get progressively placed to the point where after 6 months that you couldn't be placed in the job, then you were looked at as a long-term disability being placed outside the work environment. Ultimately leading to discharge. And so essentially they're being placed in a disciplinary process for being injured or having a disability. And the process had no forgiveness for other people that could do something. For instance, we had a guy that lost his arm in a motorcycle accident, if you recall. Having experienced that with this guy, he was placed in the process, and so he was never going to grow his arm back to be able to do a fully functional job, but there were things he could do, but I couldn't place him. And so ultimately it got to the point where we sat down with the union and we placed him out. And of course it went right to a grievance and right to upper management.
Right.
And I've been telling my upper management, this is coming, you know,
Right,
the
right.
process won't forgive it. And so they seemed surprised when it got to him anyway.
Well, a couple things there. First of all, I think we probably all recognize there's an issue there potentially with ADA, right? American Disabilities Act and reasonable accommodation and what's perceived as reasonable accommodation, which there's some interpretation of. And American Disabilities Act, Amendments Act, actually put a lot more teeth into that, the requirements. And so the onus is going to be more on the employer to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of really trying good faith effort, trying to accommodate an individual. Now, I'll say that with also saying this. We, and I say we, labor and management, need to look at our collective bargaining agreements and see how are we really holding ourselves to a standard that we really didn't intend to. In other words, holding ourselves to some strict step-by-step process that ends up limiting what we can do in terms of remedy. You see what I'm saying? So we need to make sure we're writing collective bargaining agreements that give us the latitude to be able to take care of situations like that, especially if you've got an employee who can do some other work. But see, you get into things like, and you know what I'm talking about, violating other seniority rights and other things like that. So how do you get past that without being locked in to a bureaucratic process that has unintended consequences, right? How can we keep everybody working and try to look for opportunities for that individual who could do other work, right? But then you got the legal aspect of it too. So, any other questions? Yes, Cam.
The studies along on different types of discipline, like the aggressive as opposed to positive. Did you have notice any difference in data when it comes to utilizing union representatives to assist in the discipline process?
Well, in both processes, there was union involvement. Because in both models, the progressive, obviously, you have, you don't want to violate Weingarten rights, and you would have presence of a union representative when you dealt with the discipline. And in the positive model, that was part of the process. Part of the process was to co-coach between you and the committee person. So there was complete involvement. And the reason the union agreed to that in this model was because it was non-punitive. That's why they agreed they would do that. They would cooperate, and engage in a positive model because it was non-punitive. It was an alternative model that allowed for some non-punitive consequences. Okay, and the person was basically at the steering wheel. They could make a decision how they wanted to approach it. Either, get engaged and recognize what they did and try to make some changes and work with management to do that, or not. But in most cases, you can see the success rate. The success rate was phenomenal in this study. There's more work that can be done. But
I didn't know if there were some of the cases that had no representation as opposed to those that did have union representation.
Now, in this study again, there wasn't the absence of the union, but I can tell you my own philosophy, which I think you probably already know. We've been around each other a long time, because I feel like if we're not both on board, then it's not going to work effectively, or as effectively as it could, right? So we both should be working together towards a common goal. I had a newly elected committee man one time that he came to my office. He just got elected, hours before, okay? He just got the results. He comes storming into my office, and he said, all right, things are going to change around here now. He had a grievance pad with him. He says, I'm going to have this whole book filled up in the next week. I looked at him and I said, okay. I said, I understand. And he went storming off. And as he stormed off, and I said, I'm going to give this about 2 weeks, and you're going to be back talking to me. He went, oh. He went storming off. So it was about a week later, so I was off by a week. He came back to my office, and his head was kind of hung low, and he had an employee issue he needed my help with. And he approached my office. He said, go ahead, tell me, what's wrong. And I said, no, I'm not. I said, we're partners. Have a seat. Tell me what you need, right? Because that's really how you get things done. And we ended up having a really good productive relationship after that, but it was a paradigm shift for him, because he was thinking you, I, and I was thinking we, and I'm like, give it time. About 2 weeks, you're going to find out it's we. It happened in a week, though. All right. Any other questions? I think I've probably eaten up all my time. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill. What's next, Bill?
Well, Eric Kaczynski is coming in
Oh.
from Illinois.
Do we have break time? So break time?
It starts at 3:30
Oh.
and 2:15.
Oh. Okay. So I had more time.
No, you had a lot more time. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ken.
Okay. Thank you.
And I want to thank him for initiating and doing a wonderful job on an important topic. Our next session is being led by Eric Kaczynski, who just drove in. Hi, Eric. Who just drove in from Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. Eric, here he is.
Yay.
Eric is the executive director of the Labor and Employment Relations Association, and our afternoon session will focus on
I had a comment, but I didn't want to mention it because most of the union talk they were talking
It's because I'm talking to a lot of union people here.
Are you familiar with Ken Blanchard's
No.
series of books? Oh, 1 minute, that was my Bible.
Oh, really?
1 minute later.
Yeah.
I used to tell them,
I met him, by the way. Yeah. Yeah.
I used
At
to
an ASTD
rate
conference.
my employees with the 1 minute managers and the 1 minute manager alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the basic fundamental things. I told them, I said, 3 things you need to remember.
furloughs that were
1 minute
mandated by the
reprimand,
federal government
1
shutdown.
minute goal setting,
Our
1 minute
15-year-old practice
redirection.
of
I said, don't harp on it. Tell them what they did wrong. You know, tell them something they did good.
people from the National
Tell them what they did wrong, and then tell them what they're going to do to
This
fix
year
it.
we're having
And don't
Andrea
harp.
Hogan was
You know,
supposed to come
less
down.
times. But, you know, I was like, yeah, I don't know if they can use it in the union or
She's
not.
the director of NIOSH's National Safe and Healthy Workplace Initiative. And then, as all of you who have been to our conferences before will recall, we paired that up in an afternoon session with Steve Hawkins, who's the Assistant Director of the Tennessee Occupational Safety and Health, and he does his annual review of death and doom in the workplace in Tennessee, and also the changes in regulatory practices and legislation that affects the Tennessee workplace. And we're hopeful that Congress will not still be shutting down the federal government a year from now when we have our next meeting, and they'll be able to attend. Dr. Hogan has already assured me that that's her intention to come and join us in 2014. We have a brief time. Some of you, all of you have some work to do, and I think Eric wants to get settled in a little bit. But Eric, do you think we might start about 3 o'clock with you? It would be about 45 minutes. I am ready to rock whenever you are. Rock and roll.
Okay.
Why don't we take a break for about half an hour, and then we'll get Eric settled in and get him set up for his presentation, and then we'll move our schedule forward a little bit and adapt to the circumstances as they have presented themselves to us. I also want to note that our evening speaker, our featured speaker this evening, Dr. Nancy Tomaso, is here. She's Vice Dean at Rutgers Business School, and very sad to be out of New Jersey on a day when we're voting for a new senator. Pardon? Good, early voting is we're cutting back on that, and so, but she's here already, and Nancy and I have known each other since our early graduate school days at the University of Wisconsin in the early 1970s. We started graduate school when we were 5 years old. And so she very generously accepted my invitation, and it occurred to me to invite her to come join us because I heard her being interviewed on National Public Radio about her latest book and her most recent research on labor markets and networks and the diversity of opportunity that is associated with the resources that all of us may or may not When we were graduate students, saying sort of would be a great compliment. Usually her criticisms were much harsher. So she's mellowed where I'm closer to being right than I usually am. To hear the truth of it all, you'll, I hope, be joining us at our dinner at 6 o'clock. So why don't we take a half-hour break? I'll get Eric settled in, and then we'll start. Thank you
Okay,
all.
thanks.